Okay, now we're going to put the supply and demand curves together, and we're going to look at all of the things that will shift that curve. Here, demand is a function of income, price of related goods, tastes and preferences, expectations, number of buyers. A change in any of those will shift the demand curve. Supply is a function of technology, price of inputs, natural disasters, or the flip side, perfect conditions, taxes, expectations, number of sellers. Okay, so let's draw a curve and let's play around with this. Here's the price and quantity and supply and demand for bicycles. There's our equilibrium price. Here's our equilibrium quantity. All right, so let's say that there is an increase in the price of automobiles. Okay, so the price goes up for automobiles. How will that affect the equilibrium price and quantity of bicycles? Well, before we get started here, we have got to define something called ceteris paribus, which means all else equal. Everything else is equal. That means that when we look at this situation here with the price of autos going up, we are holding everything else constant, all this stuff. Well, first of all, we've got to figure out what's going on. The price of automobiles. How are automobiles related to bicycles? That's the first question. We've got to figure out what's happening over here. Well, it's a related good. It's related. How is it related? Automobiles are a form of transportation. Bikes are a form of transportation. That's how they're related. A lot of times the hardest part of the question is to figure out how whatever we're doing fits into this. So, okay, we've identified that it's a related good, and it affects the demand curve. There we go. How are they related? Now, I didn't write this down here. Remember, when we're dealing with income, we've got to know if it's a normal or an inferior good. When we're dealing with related goods, we've got to know, are they substitutes or are they complements? Okay, just remember that. Well, an automobile would be another way to get around. That's a substitute. These are both different ways of getting around transportation. So, which way is the demand curve going to shift? The price of autos goes up, so people are going to buy more autos or fewer autos? Well, the price goes up, they're going to buy fewer autos, right? And what are they going to get instead? Not everybody, but some will now buy bikes. So the demand curve will shift out to the right. And we have a new equilibrium. The equilibrium price increases, equilibrium quantity increases. Again, this is ceteris paribus, all else equal. So when the price of autos goes up, we're holding tastes and preferences, expectations, number of buyers, numbers of expectations, technology, the whole thing. Everything else is constant. We're changing one variable at a time, and that's the only way we can determine the impact of the change in that one variable. Now, if there is a decrease in incomes, let's see what happens. Okay, well, let me clean this up. So there's a decrease in incomes. Income's going down. What will happen? Well, first of all, we go over here, okay, and income is listed. There it is, income. It affects demand. Income's going down. What else do we need to know here? Whenever there's a change in income, we need to know if it's a normal good or an inferior good. Well, let's say it's a normal good. Okay, we have to know that. We cannot proceed without knowing that. If it's a normal good and incomes go down, well, normal goods are goods we like. It's goods we prefer. It's goods that we want to have. And now we're not going to be able to afford what we want as much as we did before. So this is going to be a leftward shift in the demand curve. And we have a new equilibrium. Equilibrium price falls. Equilibrium quantity falls. Okay, see, piece of cake. Now, let's work on, again, that ceteris paribus, all else equal, all else held constant. Now, if you've had multivariable calculus, this is nothing but a partial derivative. You're already familiar with this concept. That's where you hold all the variables constant, and you take the derivative of just one variable. That's what we're doing here. Okay, now a little vocabulary that you're going to run into. Well, first of all, vocabulary. Speaking of vocabulary, is that a change in demand or a change in quantity demanded? Well, when the whole curve shifts, we call that a change in demand. So we've had a change in demand. Income has gone down, demand changed. Is that a change in supply or a change in quantity supplied? Well, the supply curve didn't go anywhere. It didn't shift. So that's not a change in supply. It's a change in quantity supplied. So we just saw a change in demand and a change in quantity supplied. Now, what direction was the change? Usually, actually, we will talk about the direction. So instead of saying change in demand, we'll be a little more specific. Did demand increase or decrease? Well, it was a shift to the left. A shift to the left means there was a decrease in demand. So we saw a decrease in demand. And what happened to quantity supplied? Well, we moved from this point to this point. Okay, and we're looking at this axis. When we're talking about an increase or a decrease, we're looking at the quantity axis. So from here to here, quantity fell. So we would say that's a decrease in quantity supplied. So we had a decrease in demand and a decrease in quantity supplied. Okay? Now, let's suppose that there was an increase in the price of steel used to make bicycle frames. So there's a price increase in the price of steel. That's an E. And it says the steel is used to make bicycle frames. So what over here? That would be the price of an input, right? Price of an input increased. That affects supply. So if the price of an input goes up, that increases production costs. Firms are going to produce less if their costs go up. So that would be a leftward shift in the supply curve. That would be a decrease in supply, or a change in supply, but more specifically a decrease in supply. And that is, we have a new equilibrium right there. Equilibrium price goes up. Equilibrium quantity goes down. Is that a change in demand or a change in quantity demanded? Well, it's a movement along the curve from this point to this point. That's a change in quantity demanded. More specifically, since we're moving this way, it is a decrease in quantity demanded. All right, what if there's an environmental movement? Okay, an environmental movement that bicycles are the thing to do. We want to have these non-pollution modes of transportation. So, let's see. We go over here. Well, we don't see environmental movement anywhere, but we do see tastes and preferences. There's been a preference for bicycles. That affects demand. So, that is going to shift the demand out to the right. An increase in demand. We've got a new equilibrium price right there. Equilibrium price has increased. Equilibrium quantity has increased. And you see here that there is a movement along the supply curve. That would be a change in supply, but more specifically, excuse me. Oh, I was testing you, yes. That's a change in quantity supplied, a movement along the curve, or more precisely, an increase in quantity supplied. Now, consumers expect bicycle prices to fall in the future. Expect prices to fall. And it's important to note here that it is consumers. Why do we need to note that? Because expectations affect both supply and demand. So it specifically says consumers expect the price to fall. Well, if you think the bike price is going to go down in the future, how's that going to affect your demand for bikes today? You going to hurry and run out and buy the bike at the higher price? No, you're going to hang back. Going to wait and see. Watch those prices. So that will shift demand to the left. If you expect prices to fall, today's demand will fall. And, you know, a lot of these things in economics are self-fulfilling prophecies, actually. See that a lot in financial markets. If everybody expects the price to fall, then demand falls now, and guess what happens? The price falls. So that would be a decrease in demand and a decrease in quantity supplied. Equilibrium price falls, equilibrium quantity falls. Now there's a technological advance in the manufacture of bicycles. They've got a better way to do it, more efficient way to do it, faster way to do it, whatever. Well, change in technology affects supply. A new technology is going to enable them and give them the incentive to crank out production. It's going to be a rightward shift in supply. New equilibrium. Equilibrium price falls, equilibrium quantity increases. That's a rightward shift of the supply curve, so that's a change in supply or an increase in supply. And that's a movement along the demand curve. That's a change in quantity demanded or an increase in quantity demanded. Okay. Now we see this all the time in consumer electronics. Consumer electronics, we just keep seeing the supply curve shift further and further and further. So something, when it comes on the market, it might be quite expensive, but over time, it just keeps on going. Now there's a reduction in the price of bicycle helmets and shoes. So the price goes down for helmets and bike shoes. How are helmets and bike shoes related to bicycles? Well, they're related. Okay, they're a related good. How are they related? Are they substitutes? You have a helmet or a bike? Either one's good? No. A bike helmet and bike shoes are used with bikes. They are complements. And you want both. You got to have both of these. So part of the puzzle here, part of the package has fallen. That means the whole package, the bike and the helmet and the shoes, are more affordable than they were before. That will shift the bike demand curve out to the right. Equilibrium price increases, equilibrium quantity increases. That's an increase in demand and an increase in quantity supplied. Now let's suppose that income goes down, but this time we're going to say the bikes are an inferior good. Okay, people would rather drive their cars or some other means of transportation, but now the income has gone down. They can't buy cars as much as they could before. Cars are less affordable. So what are you going to do? You're going to buy a bike instead. So what happens to the demand for bikes if incomes fall and bikes are inferior? Well, people are going to be forced to buy bikes now because they can't afford what they really want. So demand shifts to the right. New equilibrium. Equilibrium price rises. Equilibrium quantity rises. So that's an increase in demand and an increase in quantity supplied. Okay, let's complicate things a little bit. Let's say that the price of, let's say steel again. Price of steel falls, and also the price of automobiles goes up. Price of automobiles go up and the price of steel falls. Aha. Well, the price of steel used to make bikes, that's the price of an input. So supply is going to shift in response to this change in the price of steel. The price of automobiles goes up. Well, how are autos related to bikes? They're both alternative modes of transportation, so that's a related good. Here, they're substitutes, not complements. You don't ride your bike and drive your car at the same time. So, let's see what happens to equilibrium price of quantity. Well, we'll take this one at a time. If the price of steel falls, that's going to shift the supply curve to the right. There'll be an increase in supply because of lower production costs, because of the inputs have fallen. So, have an increase in supply. And how about demand? If the price of automobiles goes up, well, fewer people are going to buy autos and more people are going to buy bikes. So demand shifts to the right. We have a new equilibrium. Equilibrium quantity changes or increases. The way I drew this, however, shows no change in price. But it all depends. It's inconclusive. We know that equilibrium quantity is going to increase because both the demand shift and the supply shift, they both increase equilibrium quantity. If you do it one at a time, you'll see they both do that. So there's no doubt that that's going to happen. But what if the demand curve shifts way out here? The supply curve shifts to the right, but demand shifts more. If demand shifts more, let's see, there's our equilibrium right there. Just assume that's the demand curve right there. And price will rise. If supply shifts further than demand, let's say that's the supply curve, it shifts way out here, there's a new equilibrium. Equilibrium price will fall. So, we don't know. We don't know. Without more information, we don't know. Now, if the problem says that supply shifts further than demand, we know that price is going to go the direction that supply. An increase in supply will take the price because it's the more powerful effect. If demand shifts further than supply, then the demand curve shift is the more powerful effect. So, yes, equilibrium quantity increases. Equilibrium price, well, depends on which curve shifts the most. Now let's take a brief look at price ceilings and price floors. Price controls. Okay, so here we've got the equilibrium price and quantity. And that's the best place to start. Start out, and by the way, I've said this before, but get out a piece of paper when you do these problems, and I highly recommend you do these, practice problems. That you go through these, but get out a piece of paper and actually draw these curves and shift them. You do them in your head. You do the, if you're staring at the computer and you do these in your head, you're going to make a mistake, or at least you're far more likely to. So let's suppose that let's say that there's a minimum wage, okay, and it is increased. What might happen to supply? Well, higher production costs will shift the supply curve to the left. But what I want to do now is look at the market for, unskilled, often called unskilled or low-skilled workers, like burger flippers. Let's just say burger flippers because, I was a burger flipper at Wendy's. Good times. So as a proud former burger flipper, and I loved the term burger flipper when I was there. I assume it's still okay to say that. Well, this is the market for burger flippers, but we usually don't use price. We use, when we're talking about the price of labor services, we usually are talking about wages. So the price, we'll put a W there for wage. Okay, there's the equilibrium wage. And let's actually give it a number. Some of these questions you'll want numbers. Let's say the equilibrium wage is $10 an hour. Okay. And now, Congress says you cannot pay less than $12 an hour. Wages can't go below that point. When wages can't go, or a price can't go below a certain point, we call that a price floor. It can't go below that floor. So what happens? Well, we're going to have a decrease in quantity demanded. We're going to move along this line. So quantity demanded will fall to here. And quantity supplied will increase from here to here. Where's that quantity supply come from? Well, at $10 an hour, you go to school full time. At $12 an hour, well, maybe I'll only go part time. You've got homemakers, home with the kids for 10, but 12, maybe I'll drop them off at mom's house and let her watch them, and I'll go and make a few extra bucks. Okay, so more people will enter here, and the higher that minimum wage gets, the bigger the supply is. Of course, the less the demand is. So let's give that a number. Let's say, let's just say 10, and this is 12, and this is 8. Okay, that's not a very good 8. That's an even worse 8. We call that a surplus because only 8 are demanded, but 12 are supplied. What is the term in economics when there is a surplus of labor, where there are more people looking for jobs than there are jobs available? We call that unemployment. Okay, that's what unemployment is. And we're going to talk more about that in a later chapter. But if the minimum wage is above, if it's above the equilibrium wage, meaning if equilibrium cannot be achieved, there's a floor, there's a price control keeping it from being achieved, it will cause a surplus of labor, and that's unemployment. Now, here's kind of a trick question. I'll tell you right off the bat, it's a trick question. Let's say the minimum wage is here. Okay, the minimum wage is a price floor. We'll just call it the minimum wage. Wages now cannot go below this point. Let's say that's 8. Wages can't go below $8. What's the situation there? Well, at $8, here's the quantity supplied, here's the quantity demanded. So quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. At $8, meaning Burger King's trying to hire more people than there are people who want to be hired, right? That's called a shortage. Except for this is not a binding price control. We call it a binding price control if there is something in the way of equilibrium being achieved. This minimum wage just says wages can't go below this point. Wages have no trouble going above this point, okay? So it's not in the way. If the minimum wage is $8, there's nothing to prevent market forces from achieving the equilibrium rate of $10. So a minimum wage will cause unemployment if it's above equilibrium or the market clearing rate. It will not cause unemployment if it's below the market clearing rate. And I used to ask students all this all the time. I guess I can ask you, but since you're out there in internet land, it's harder to do. But I remember going to McDonald's and seeing hiring happy faces. I think the one I remember the most is it was like $8 an hour, something like that. And the minimum wage was at the time was around $5 or $6 an hour. Why is McDonald's hiring people for $8 when by law they only have to pay them $5 or $6? Because they're nice guys? They may be the nicest guys in the world, but that isn't why they're paying more than the minimum wage. Because of these supply and demand curves. McDonald's has to compete with Burger King and Pizza Hut and Burritoville, okay? Walmart, lots of places. They've got to compete with them for labor. And that's where the curves meet. That's what they're paying. So if minimum wage is below equilibrium, we say that's a non-binding wage. It doesn't do anything. It's almost like it's not even there. If it's above equilibrium, then it will cause some unemployment. How much? Well, it depends on if you're talking long run or short run. It depends on how elastic the supply and demand are. Some other variables. Okay. And the time horizon, all that. So more about that actually in micro. So that is a price floor. Now, let's talk about a price ceiling. Well, let's say these are apartments, okay? Here's the equilibrium price and quantity. And a law is passed that says you can't charge more rent than that. That is a price ceiling. Can't go above that. Well, we call that rent control. Now, rent control, just like whenever you interfere with a market, whenever you interfere with supply and demand reaching equilibrium, there's going to be a problem. So here, if the rent control price is below equilibrium, well, here's quantity supplied. How come quantity supplied falls? Well, because a lot of these apartments, these landlords, see, they can afford to charge this. They can't afford to charge this. This isn't enough. They'll sell. They'll turn them into condominiums and sell them. Okay. Also, fewer will be built over time. Okay, so no new ones because there's not money in it. Real estate developers aren't going to get involved anymore. So you're going to, and in extreme cases, you see this in New York City, abandoned. When you can't even pay the property tax on it, they abandon the building. That's why you see these abandoned buildings in New York City, is they were abandoned because of rent control. As one economist said, it's pretty hard to tell. In cities that have rent control, it's hard to tell if the city was bombed or if it has rent control because they look pretty darn similar. Certainly an unintended consequence, but a consequence, intended or not. That's the outcome. And quantity demanded increases. Well, heck yeah. You've got more people looking in the city closer to work that now at the lower price. You've got kids saying, hey, graduated from high school, hey, let's go get an apartment. They're cheap. So you've got all these, increased people looking for apartments. You got these, not as many available. So what's the difference between the two? Again, let's put in some numbers. We have a shortage. When quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, that is a shortage. And this shortage came out of thin air by this price control, this price ceiling. So what is the shortage? Well, there's 12 demand, quantity demand is 12, quantity supplied is 8, so there's a shortage of 4, right? What happens when there's less housing? Well, homelessness rises. Cities where there's rent controls. See, there used to be 10, now there's only 8. Supply is drying up. Some of those people don't have homes now. Okay, so lots of stuff going on with rent control. Another topic we spent a lot of time on. But I just wanted to introduce you quickly to price controls. Whenever we get involved and we don't like the law of supply and demand, if we try to repeal the law of supply and demand and try to mess with it and keep this equilibrium from being achieved, it's going to have adverse consequences. Now, not everybody suffers, don't get me wrong. Same with the minimum wage. Those who keep their jobs are better off. They get a higher wage. And those who have these 8 units, they used to pay this price. Now they're only paying this price. They benefit. So, I mean, there's always winners and losers, but the consequences are there's an increase in landlords aren't going to take care of their buildings like they used to. When they get charged this, they took care of the buildings. When they're charging this, they're not. So we've got, it's been called the greatest slum producer, rent control. It will turn a neighborhood into slums in a flash. So those neighborhoods start being not kept up. So other than that, they might be living in a broken down apartment with things not working the way they ought to, but they're paying less. Okay. All right. Well, that is it for supply and demand. Chapter 4 is in the books, and do the practice problems. Do lots of practice. Okay. This is tell yourself a little story, draw the curves, shift them around. Step by step. Don't skip any steps. That's when things get hard. It's when you skip steps.